5 Live Formula One.
Hello and welcome to the start of FP3, the third and final practice session of the Hungarian Grand Prix weekend. And after the rain of yesterday, there are blue skies above the Hungaroring today. So it looks like we're going to see a lot more track action than we did yesterday. In the commentary box, talking us through that action will be commentator Chris Hartley, BBC's F1 chief F1 writer, I'm going to get that right one day, the BBC's chief F1 writer, Andrew Benson, and Williams' former Formula One driver, Jack Aitken. Jack, I'm going to start with you because yesterday we had limited running. It was rainy, we had a few red flags, but actually one of the real reasons why drivers were staying in the garage was because they were saving tyres. We've got this alternative tyre allocation this weekend for qualifying later on, but it's already had a knock-on effect in the earlier part of the weekend. Are you a fan of this new format with the drivers having to use the hard tyre in Q1, the medium in Q2 and the soft in Q3 later on?
So I think that they don't have to be put together into the same basket. I love the idea of qualifying being shaken up a little bit and seeing how they handle the challenge of those hard tyres, particularly if it's a little bit cooler than they were expecting. How do they get those fired up? How's it going to affect the traffic situation? I think that's really interesting. The allocation side of things, reducing the number of tyres available to them, I actually agree with the drivers. I think that's a bit of a shame for the fans, but it's something that we see across motorsport everywhere, that it's this fight of you don't want to be wasteful bringing hundreds of thousands of tyre sets to a weekend that may or may not get used at the end of the day, all of them. But the knock-on effect is less track time. It is meaning more time in the garage for the teams and less action for the fans, which is always a shame.
Yeah, and Chris, some drivers, Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, being quite vocal about this new format and saying that they don't like it. They need to be focusing their attentions elsewhere when it comes to Formula One and sustainability, perhaps less wet tyres, less intermediate tyres being brought to track because we waste quite a lot of those. But yesterday, what did you take away from the day? Because we couldn't really deduce much, could we?
Not really. The 10 minutes or so that we had at the end of the first practice session was wet, but with intermediates, not completely sodden wet. And then in the dry running, we had a mix. Because everybody had lost so much time in free practice one. There weren't too many drivers going for single lap pace. There were some longer runs. I mean, the McLarens looked good on longer run pace, and had some quotes overnight from Lando Norris saying he was pleased with the car, felt confident with the car, both on a longer and a shorter run, so that looked positive. He ended the second practice session only 15 thousandths of a second slower than the fastest driver, which was Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari. Had a really attacking lap, actually, looked good in the Ferrari and his fast lap on the soft tyres. But yeah, I mean, I understand the objective of trying to become more sustainable is commendable in that respect, and reducing it for this race and Monza from 13 sets to 11 sets of tyres. Pirelli bring 1,800 tyres to each and every Grand Prix, so it's an awful lot of tyres. But Lewis Hamilton made the point, Jack, that most races they throw away a lot of wet tyres, an awful lot of wet tyres, so maybe they should look at other ways of being more sustainable.
I think what a lot of people don't realise is that when you mount a set of Pirelli Formula One tyres to a set of rims ready to go, sitting in the back of the garage in case they're needed, if they don't get used for whatever reason at that event and they are taken off the rims, they're garbage. They cannot be used again, because such on the margins that the engineers are working to at Pirelli, that you can only mount them once. It's quite a strenuous process for the tyre and the bead and locking it in place. It just goes to the tip. They do recycle part of the tyres, but it's a bit of a waste. So yeah, it's a big problem for motorsport, but we don't want to see cars in the garages at the end of the day. That's a massive shooting your own foot situation, isn't it? Shooting your foot? I don't know where I'm going with that.
Don't worry, I'm struggling as well. My teeth are only just in this morning. The alternative tyre allocation will be seen again later on in the season in Italy. Andrew Benson, Lewis Hamilton saying that his car yesterday was at its worst. We know that the Mercedes does take a little time to bed in over the course of a weekend. It also takes over 18 months to bed in as well, as it turns out. What's going on with Mercedes? We've seen such a turn of pace from the Mercedes-powered vehicles this year, Aston Martin, the McLaren, and yet the works team really struggling to get on top of things. What does it look like for them, the outlook this weekend?
Well, the Hamilton negative comments on Friday becoming a bit of a pattern, actually. I'm always looking for a sort of angle to juice up the Friday practice report a bit, to be honest. and Lewis normally provides it by saying something terrible about the car, and but it's not always then terrible on Saturday and Sunday, and that's the point he then went on to make yesterday straight away. Actually, maybe someone had a word with him at Mercedes. Maybe they'd seen the same pattern as I had, and George Russell had also said something similar. So look, the big picture is questions are being asked of Mercedes at the moment, because there's been a series of what are they doing moments. You know, first of all, last year's car didn't work. Hamilton obviously, behind the scenes, we didn't know it at the time, but he was obviously making his views clear about what they needed to do with the car, what was wrong with it. And then when this car came out this year and looked very like last year's car, and it wasn't quick again, he wasted no time in saying, look, I told you, you didn't listen to me. In fact, he said it to you, Rosanna. It was a really great line after the Bahrain Grand Prix. Now we're seeing Aston Martin have made a big leap forward over the winter. Now McLaren have made a big leap forward during a season. And people are asking, why can't Mercedes do the same? And the question fundamentally is, one part of the answer to that is, well, it looks like the fundamental architecture of this car can't be modified in a way that makes it look like a Red Bull, basically, or work like a Red Bull. But the second question, based on some of the remarks that Mercedes themselves are making, is, do they actually understand how to make a car go as fast as a Red Bull? Do they understand how that philosophy of aerodynamics works? Because Toto Wolff said at the last race in Silverstone, we had that design in the wind tunnel and we lost downforce with it. And so everyone in the paddock's asking, well, why can't you see what McLaren and Aston Martin can see? What's going on? Is there something fundamentally wrong within the Mercedes understanding of aerodynamics under this current set of regulations? We won't know the answer to that question until next year, but it's very much a live question.
Absolutely. Another big question is how Daniel Ricciardo is going to fare in the AlphaTauri. Of course, jumping into the AlphaTauri seat that Nick de Vries has vacated, having been sacked from Formula One in the lead up to this race weekend. We have got a green light. We're in a few minutes into the session now. But just before I hand over to you guys in the commentary box, what do we take away from Daniel Ricciardo's performance yesterday? He was behind his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, who actually had a pretty good day of it. Was Daniel just finding his feet, or is this AlphaTauri really as difficult as we thought it was to drive, and he's struggling out there?
Well, Daniel said, times weren't really important yesterday. It was just about getting a feel for the car. Today, or yesterday, was more about feeling where I am at with the car rather than setting quick lap times. He said there's a bit more left in me. We'll push a bit more tomorrow. He's the chief race engineer at AlphaTauri, Jonathan Eddles, has said, had this whole plan put in place for getting Daniel some good running, lots of track time yesterday, but of course getting him comfortable with the car became difficult with the conditions they had in free practice one, which goes back to what you were saying yesterday, Jack, about sometimes the weather and circumstances and red flags, all of which we had yesterday in free practice one, completely scupper your plan A for what you want to do in terms of your programme of running in a session.
It does, but we know that Daniel's quite an experienced driver anyway. He's got plenty of race starts under his belt, and it shouldn't be track time shouldn't be that crucial for him to really get up to speed here. And he's probably more interested in just getting a bit of a handle on the characteristics of the AlphaTauri itself, which he's obviously not driven in a very long time, and the differences between that and the Red Bull, which he has been testing in so far this year. So he's got plenty of time. He's got an hour now of what looks like quite representative running. The tracks are quite in a nice window for temperature in terms of comparing to Sunday's Grand Prix. So it's all going to be quite valuable for him today.
So you can see yesterday's Ricciardo running as relatively positive in that on the first set of tyres in the second practice session, which was the only dry running that anyone got, he worked his way down over four timed laps with a cool down lap in between, charge lap, down to more or less the same time as Yuki Tsunoda, which that's good. He was then 4/10 off on his new tyre run, but he said afterwards that there was definitely some time that he left out on track. He wasn't worried about that. He thinks he can find that time today. But what we're going to be looking out for, obviously, is that actually the case? Because it's one thing for a racing driver to say he thinks he can find the time, Jack. It's another thing for him to actually do it when it comes to qualifying.
Yeah, I mean, you'd hope that he's fairly honest, because I don't think there's a lot to gain for him at this stage by trying to bluff his way through this situation. And I can well believe that, because yeah, it's not going for a fast lap time, setting purple sectors is not necessarily hand in hand the best thing to do with learning a new car and jumping into a new team like that. Although, like I said, he's quite experienced. just taking a bit of time to try some different techniques, different styles with the car. Does it like it being driven aggressively? Do you have to sort of sneak up on the corners a little bit, be a bit cautious on the entries? We know that AlphaTauri has had some issues with its entry stability so far this season, and that's something that Daniel's quite sensitive to. So all of these questions, it takes him a lot of time and trial and error basically to go through, more than 4 laps worth. So yeah, he definitely won't have been looking to put it all together straight away.
No, I think that's absolutely fair point. I'm going to give you, for those of you that want a time sync in a moment, so fingers over buttons if you're ready to do that. But yeah, just to go back finally to the Daniel Ricciardo point, the overriding thing, as Andrew was saying really yesterday, that came from the team, was that he was good on the mediums, but he wasn't quite utilising the soft tyre enough. So it does sound like there's more to come. He'll take that feedback. He's a hugely experienced driver with won 230 Grand Prix to his name, 8 Grand Prix victories, so I'm sure he'll take it. We're looking at pictures at the moment of Logan Sargent, who is looking to go out shortly in the Williams, and out on track his teammate Alex Albon currently. Right time sync, we are watching with 53 minutes, 53, 52 seconds, 51 seconds and 50 seconds on the clock. And the track's starting to get a bit busier now. We've had early running from Max Verstappen, the world champion, with a 1:18.478. Pole time in qualifying last year, set by George Russell, was a 1:17.3. And Charles Leclerc yesterday, impressive in the dry running in free practice too. Got pretty close to that, just 0.3 of a second away with a 1:17.6. So we're looking at the Williams now, and the team have been saying this isn't really necessarily a track that's going to suit the fundamental strengths of the Williams, but we're going to try and push and get into the top 10. And Jack Alex has been going well in qualifying lately. He's qualified 3 times now of late into the top 10, into the final part of qualifying.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of see that the team aren't necessarily expecting that kind of repeat performance again, because they're out on another set of softs this morning, and of course this weekend we're quite limited with tyres. We can see that with nearly half the field are actually still in the pit lane waiting for track conditions just to come to them a little bit, wait for it to be a bit more rubber on the track, a bit hotter, and let the rest of the field rubber it in for them. But the Williams of Albon is about to set a lap time on the soft. They'd set a lap time yesterday on the soft as well, so they've already gone through half of their allocation of softs. So I think the teams that are expecting to be fighting at the pointy end in Q3 are obviously trying to save those as much as possible, like the Red Bulls, who have been out on the medium this morning. Just getting a replay now of Carlos Sainz, a bit wide into turn 2, but I was thinking, okay, a little snap from the rear, but we're relatively under control, a bit wiggly through 3 as well.
I think I'm just struggling with the wind.
Interesting. I'm struggling with the wind, and now we get an exterior replay, and yeah, he really did tail end the car out there on the way out to turn 2. Sparks flew as he went downhill through turn 3. Carlos was one of the drivers that had an off in the wet conditions early on yesterday. Just kissed the barrier on the exit to that part of the course at turn 3, because we had a big off, or fairly big off, for Sergio Perez on his out lap right at the start of the session yesterday. Didn't set a time in that session, was down the tail end of the times in the second free practice session, but he's got out early as well, and he's had a bit of a nerve settler, I suppose, because he's gone second quickest to his teammates Max Verstappen with a 1:18.558 on a track on which he's never actually finished on the podium. He got 5th place last year, Sergio Perez, here at the Hungaroring, but he's not been on the podium here previously. Charles Leclerc, who was quickest yesterday, 3rd with a 1:19.565 second lap. And we've also had lap times from 9 cars now. Remember, 11 of them were the only ones that set a time in the first free practice session yesterday, so they're playing catch up as we get Perez radio.
Tires are not cooling down. Yeah, I think this is what we're going to have to live with in qualifying.
So it'll be interesting if we see any drivers going for a double cool down. So we know that the tyres get worked particularly hard here in Budapest, and if it's going to be hotter conditions, you just don't have enough time on a 1.5-minute lap, or a bit longer than that when you're going slowly, to let the surface of the tyre, and more critically the carcass of the tyre, really the core of the tyres, cool down. And yeah, we have seen teams in the past go for a double cool down just to try and give it a bit more time to come back into that operating window.
Jack, conversely, Perez is on the mediums at the moment. He's talking about cooling down. But when it comes to qualifying later on, with this stipulation of using the hard tyre in Q1, how many laps are they going to need to warm that hard tyre up to get it to perform, to get themselves through to the next part of qualifying?
Yeah, it's a bit of an unknown. I think the teams will have their sort of best guess of it. Not many teams have run the hard so far. this weekend, probably because they may feel like that's potentially the race tyre that they want to have good use of on Sunday's Grand Prix. And if you use a set now in practice and you use a set in qualifying in the first part, which you are obligated to do, then you're suddenly left a bit short for the race. So they're all kind of happy to do a suck it and see approach. It may be that they just fuel up the car, say, well, keep going until you hit the warm-up window of the tyre. If it gets too hot, you can take a cool down, but especially the teams like Red Bull, Ferrari, that are expecting to get through quite easily, they can afford to take a bit of a safer approach there. Lower down the grid, who knows, we may see a bit more of a varied approach on the strategy for warming up those hards.
And also when it comes to the race, Pirelli thinking that the C5, the softest tyre of the range, could actually be a good race tyre. So those teams who are already envisaging they won't make it through to the sharp end of qualifying are then slightly stitching themselves up for the race because they don't have those softs available. Or can they just bolt on some used ones if the need be?
I'd be surprised if the C5 was going to be a good race tyre, but maybe, Andrew, you know more?
I agree with you, Jack. I think, frankly, those Pirelli predictions about tyres, might just throw them in the bin. Because the teams, just when you tell the teams what Pirelli have predicted on the strategy, they just basically, they're too polite to laugh, but that's what they're doing inside.
We're all laughing now, aren't we? So that's good.
Not at all.
Not at all.
Very serious.
Well, they have written it down black and white that they think the C5 could be an option come Sunday afternoon. Yeah. But who knows?
Of course, it depends on the track conditions, doesn't it? If it turns out to be a bit cold and miserable, then maybe it will come into its own. We saw in previous Grand Prix here that the expected race tyre was not the one that ended up coming good, as it were. So you never know. You have to react.
To be fair, the soft tyre was good last year, but if I'm not mistaken, they had a slightly harder range of tyres last year. It was the C2, 3 and 4, whereas this year it's the C3, 4 and 5. So if it's... And last year it started damp and, well, it was kind of dry by the start of the race, but it was very cool conditions. So those are the sort of conditions where you would expect the softer compounds to be more usable, and they were, because Max Verstappen used a softer great effect to win from 10th on the grid last year. But if it's hot in Hungary, like it often is, then obviously, and with softer compound tyres, then it'll turn it completely the other way around.
And with the caveat that Pirelli were talking about the C5, the softest tyre, being operational in a temperature window of around 34 degrees yesterday, which is already, I think, 10 degrees cooler than what we're seeing track temperature of today, Chris. I think it was 44 when we started.
Yeah, already 44 degrees at lunchtime, so 24 degrees air temperature, very hot track temperature, already a bit more like the Hungaroring. We've become used to the first Grand Prix. It was 1986, and I think it was 20 years before they actually had any kind of wet race. But it's becoming increasingly common. The last 6 Grand Prix now, including this one, we've had at least one wet session across the course of the weekend. We're looking at George Russell. Had a slightly odd day yesterday because in the wet he was quickest in free practice 1. In free practice 2 he was the slowest. So he's 9/10 of a second down at the split at the moment through 2 sectors, just making his way into the left-hander at turn 13, kisses the apex, goes through there and accelerates towards the last turn at turn 14, 4th gear corner. They drop down to just under 90 miles an hour, then bang it up through the gears, runs over the curbs on the exit, goes over the finish line, and he ends up 9/10 down. So the third sector was pretty good, actually. He held on to the fastest time of Verstappen through that part of the lap, but overall 5th quickest, 1 minute 19.4. Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon in the Alpines. Pierre had a good day yesterday. He was 3rd. They're on the soft tyres, but they have gone 3rd and 4th behind the 2 Red Bulls. The Red Bulls having set their quickest lap times on the medium tyre.
I just want to make one very small point here. It is early days, but I'm looking at those Red Bull lap times and the gap between them and everybody else and thinking, uh-oh. 8/10 they've got on Ocon and Gasly in the Alpines. They had a second on Leclerc on the same medium tyre. Ocon and Gasly are on the softs. Russell's now 9/10 behind Verstappen on the same medium tyre.
The Astons as well.
The Astons are
1.2 and 1.4 seconds on the soft.
On the soft. Yeah. This reminds me a little bit of some of the Red Bull Hungaroring races in the early 2010s with Vettel and Webber, when that car was, because of its aerodynamic efficiency and strong downforce and the large number of corners at the Hungaroring, that car was in a completely different level from everything else. It's beginning to look, I mean it is anyway, we know that this year, but even more so this weekend, it's beginning to look like.
I've been looking at been sad. I've been looking at some stats of the dominance over 2 seasons. So, there have been lots of occasions in the past where a team has dominated across 1 season, but Red Bull are doing it over 2 seasons now. So they've won every race this year. They've won 27. If you go back to the start of last year, they've won 27 out of the last 32 races, right? So that's 84% of the races, which is, I'm telling you now, way more than I ever got in any exam at school. That's pretty good. If you go back to the Mercedes era when Hamilton and Rosberg were dominating, they actually did it over 3 seasons. So that's the target, I suppose, if you want to look at long-term dominance. 2014, 2015 and 2016. Mercedes in 2014 won 16 out of 19. They did the same in 2015. They won 19 out of 21 in 2016. So over 3 seasons, they won 51 out of 58 races, which is 88%. And we had the Schumacher era with Ferrari. They won over a 3-year period in 2002, 2003 and 2004. 38 out of 51 races, 75%. And then Williams, 92 and 93, when Mansell left W14B, Adrian Newey designed Wonder Car. Then he won 10 out of 16 races that year, did the same the year after, 63%. And then the record that Red Bull are trying to beat this weekend in terms of most race wins on the trot, which was set by McLaren back in 1988, Senna and Prost. They won 15 out of 16 races that year. Only Gerhard Berger at the Italian Grand Prix in a Ferrari was the only other race winner that year. But then the next year they only won 10 out of 16, so 78%. So the Mercedes is still the benchmark to beat over a 2 or 3 season period, but they're well on the way to it, and it's hard to see them not picking up quite a few more wins in the second half of the season, isn't it?
Yep, we can live in hope, but for now it looks like a bleak picture, doesn't it? Piastri, though, putting in a new purple sector 2, which is a non-Red Bull purple sector. We'll take it. So he pops himself up into P3 on the soft tyre, 4.5 tenths off, so still a chunk off when you consider the compound difference, but not a bad lap from the young Aussie. And Lando Norris is out on track as well, so he's going to be setting a time shortly, and it also looks not too bad. A few purple mini sectors coming up in sector 2. They've been quite closely matched when they've had the upgrade packages matched. So it looks like the young Aussie's taking the fight a bit to his more experienced teammate, isn't he?
Well, actually, Piastri was pretty much on Norris's pace at Silverstone last time out, and he didn't have the full upgrade that Norris had. He had, just to track it back, Norris had the upgrade, an upgraded sort of bodywork package in Austria, which Piastri didn't have any of that. Then for Silverstone, Piastri moved on to that upgraded bodywork package, but Norris had a new front wing. Now Piastri has that new front wing, so this is the first time in 3 races they've got the same spec car. So even at Silverstone, even without the new front wing, which wasn't as quantum a leap as the bodywork package was, admittedly, he was right on Norris's pace. So that made his weekends all the more impressive. So it's going to be interesting to see how he goes this weekend. I think in general, the overall stats for qualifying for Piastri aren't that great in terms of the average, but he's had a couple of qualifyings where Andrea Stella, the McLaren team principal, has been very keen to point out that he's been on Norris's pace, apart from one mistake here or one small problem there, and which have disguised his actual underlying pace. And he was making the point after Silverstone that all Silverstone was from McLaren was a confirmation of what they were already seeing, which wasn't necessarily completely obvious to everyone on the outside. I mean, he's gone a tenth quick. Norris has popped up into P5, just a tenth slower than the Aussie, but I always think it's quite indicative when you see 2 drivers so close to each other, which they have been since Silverstone, as you say, usually means that they're both doing quite a good job of maximising the equipment. One of the interesting things Stella was saying at Silverstone was that actually Piastri in some ways has been a benchmark for Norris, in the way that Norris has also been a benchmark for Piastri. So Piastri's very good in fast corners apparently, so he's often quicker than Norris, so he'll come back in and Norris can learn from him on that side, whereas there's other things that Norris is doing that Piastri can learn from it too. So they've got, he thinks Stella, I mean they would say this, but he thinks they've got a very complementary driver lineup, and that's what they were not getting from Daniel Ricciardo last year, because he was always that 2 or 3 tenths behind Norris, which is why in the end they ran out of patience with him. We just seen Fernando Alonso pop up into 6th place in the Aston Martin, which is a bit more encouraging for them, but it's still behind the Alpines and the McLarens. I think it's the worst thing as a driver when you come in and you look at the telemetry and you're 2 or 3 tenths down, but it's a little bit everywhere. That delta of time loss just goes up and up and up and up, and there's nowhere that you're better, but also nowhere where it's like, oh, there's a big chunk. And if you say, like you say, Piastri and Norris can really play off of each other, that's a fantastic situation for both of them.
Equally, it's nice to hear a team principal accepting of the fact that a rookie in Formula One is going to make a few mistakes here and there. I mean,
what?
The guy's winning everything, hasn't he? Formula Renault champion, Formula 3, Formula 2. But it's a huge step up. I mean, you've done it. You've raced, you've won in Formula 2. You've then driven a Formula 1 car. You've gone from 620 brake horsepower to 1,000 brake horsepower, but all sorts of other differences as well. What was that first step like? That first time you drove the Formula 1 car?
I mean, the hardware differences really pale into insignificance when you compare it to the difference in terms of the resource that teams are bringing to the track. Suddenly you go from having 1 or 2 engineers in a Formula 2 team and 2 mechanics to having an army of performance engineers looking in the background, each looking into a specific minute detail of the car to try and maximize that. And the same goes on the development of the car back in the factories, and they're really taking your feedback on. So for someone like Piastri, that's probably the biggest thing that he has to get used to. It helps that he was part of a program before with Alpine, so he was exposed to it in a way, and I'm sure it wouldn't have been as much of a shock. But I'm sure the driving side of it is one of the easier sides. It's actually getting the most out of the team around you.
Thanks, Jack. That's Jack Aitken, the race in the 2020 Sakir Grand Prix for Williams, and many years' experience as a reserve driver as well. And was just in a really good lap from Valtteri Bottas in the Alpha. Set the absolute best third sector, and he's gone second quickest overall. Yes, he's on the soft tyre, but you got him and his teammate Zhou Guanyu, who've now both gone quicker than Perez. So they're up to second and third, the Alphas. Perez down to fourth place, and getting a replay of Charles Leclerc here on the way into the final corner, getting crossed up at turn 14. Just a bit of oversteer there, caught it, but it sent him out wide, and that ruins one lap and the start of the next as well.
The Ferrari's been looking pretty nervy this weekend, Jack, hasn't it? It's sort of back to showing some of the bad characteristics that it was showing earlier in the year when the drivers were complaining about instability. Still only final practice, but we've seen quite a few moments like that. We saw Sainz doing that earlier in this session. Sainz had an off in the wet yesterday. I know Leclerc was fastest yesterday, but it's not looking that great for the Ferrari in terms of stability, which is really important through that middle sector around this track, Jack, isn't it?
Yeah, well, like we were saying yesterday, this place really just digs out any weakness that you have in the car. So you can't set the car up safe, because if you do that, there's so many turns, changes of direction. If you have a numb car, you're just giving away lap time every time you ask the tyres really to give you that rotation. Where the Ferraris are struggling clearly on the other side. If it's too nervy, you don't have the confidence to get on the power when you're still really leaned over in the corner with a lot of lateral G on those tyres. And it seems like that really seems, it's the traction phase where they were struggling, where Carlos had a few big snaps earlier on in turn 2. Charles there was really at the apex of the corner when the tyres finally let go, but they were kind of threatening all the way through the entry and then finally gave up big time. So yeah, it doesn't look very pleasant to drive. I'm sure that in a way, though, that's preferable for the drivers than having a really understeery car. They clearly set the car up like that and make that choice because it's going to be faster if you can keep it in a straight line.
Good effort from Kevin Magnussen. Has just gone from 17th up to 9th. He set the absolute best first sector time, actually, but he's gone 9th. His teammate Nico Hülkenberg, or Ken as we're calling him this weekend, with his platinum blonde hairstyle, is just outside the top 10 as well. In terms of qualifying this year, Hülkenberg has out-qualified Magnussen 8 times to 2. In race finishes, he's beaten him 6 times to 4 this season. So Nico, with all of his experience, never quite had that Formula 1 podium. Several fourth place finishes, but very rapid driver, reminding us just how good he is. So we've got 36 minutes and 15 seconds left on the clock. Verstappen from a very early lap, still quickest, 1 minute 18.478. Bottas recently going second with a 1:18.489, so just a fraction slower, 12 thousandths of a second slower. Zhou Guanyu in third, and we've just had Lando Norris go up to fourth. Perez is fifth. Piastri, a couple of laps ago, went up to sixth place. Gasly's down to seventh. Ocon eighth. Magnussen ninth. And we're watching Fernando Alonso, who is 10th at the moment in the Aston. And Jack, there's lots of optimism that they're going to be back on track for fighting for podiums this weekend with this car.
Yeah, they've been quietly working to get that car back to the podium after such a strong start to the season for Alonso in particular, but Stroll as well in recent races had been making some improvements in his performance as well, but the car hadn't been quite as on the pace as it was. So they would love to be back up there. I'm sure the midfield battle at the front of things is very tight, so they do need to start getting those big point finishes again. One thing that I've noticed as well, after a little rundown of the timesheet there, the two AlphaTauris have taken quite a different approach to this session compared to pretty much the entire rest of the field. I think they're the only ones that went out and did almost a long run style effort. They're 5 or 6 seconds off the pace, both of them, Tsunoda and Ricciardo. Ricciardo being slower, for those who are interested, but it doesn't mean much, I promise you. But they really just went out and pounded out some laps on the medium and didn't set any quick times, but I'm sure they will come out and do that soon.
And I don't think anybody's been out on the hard tyre yet, which you would expect they're going to have to do at some point, aren't you? With everybody having to use the hard tyre in qualifying.
They're so limited with their allocation. They've only got 2 sets. Is that right? 2 sets?
Yeah.
So if they're going to have to use one in Q1, that leaves you only 1 new set for the race if you're thinking of using it.
Yeah, you often see people not using hards through practice at all because of that, because there's only ever 2 sets of hards for a Grand Prix weekend. So it's not uncommon to see them not used in practice. Rosanna, I think you were about to make a point.
No, I was just going to make a point that actually the Alfa Romeos up in P2 and P3, they didn't use the soft tyre yesterday, similar to some other teams on the grid, so they're going for that. But yes, still not trying out that hard tyre, and they were quite comfortable on the medium yesterday, so looking fairly comfortable on the soft after what's been a fairly tricky patch for Alfa Romeo, I think, at the moment. So they'll take some kind of comfort from P2 and P3 here. But I think then it becomes a big unknown when they get to Q1, which is probably where we think teams like Alfa Romeo will make their exit in qualifying.
Yeah, I think the tyre usage across the weekend so far is rather suggesting, Jack, that the soft isn't going to be the race tyre, despite what Pirelli say, because too many teams are using too many sets of soft tyres, given the allocation that they have. They've only got 4 for the weekend.
4 instead of 8, haven't they? Yeah.
For it to be looking like a race tyre, it doesn't look like it to me.
They got one more set of hards than normal. They've got 3 sets of hards, 4 sets of mediums, and 4 sets of softs. So 11 sets instead of 13. But it's the softs that have taken the biggest hit. If you get Verstappen radio.
Just randomly lost the rear there.
Yeah, seen that.
Very chilled out way of describing almost losing the car at 200 odd miles an hour, isn't it?
It's a bit like when he nearly knocked himself out in Canada going over the curve, isn't it? All very relaxed in the cockpit of the RB19 with Max Verstappen as he sits pretty at the top of the standings. But in terms of working out how that hard will behave in Q1, Jack, I imagine the engineers are busy extrapolating the data, trying to add on what they assume the difference is, the delta between the soft and the medium, and therefore what the medium to hard would then be.
Yeah, they've got quite a lot of data to work with to make those guesstimations, as it were. They have, of course, used that tyre in the past this season, so they can take a bit of a stab at saying, well, we know this track is rougher than that track, and it has more of an energy per kilometre. So if it was okay there, then it should be okay here, etc., etc. So they've got a bit of a data bank to work with, and there's a lot of people working very hard on that. I won't pretend to have any kind of clue as to how that's going to pan out. But yeah, as we were saying, I think even if the medium looks like it might be the favoured race tyre, if it turns out to be very hot, or after the first round of pit stops things are looking like it, for whatever reason, it's going to be a high deg race, then they need to have that flexibility to switch onto that tyre.
Well, actually, we've got 3 that have just gone out on hard tyres now. So Stroll in the Aston Martin and both the AlphaTauris.
Is everything okay with the rear?
All okay, Max. Try B-Valve 4 if you want to stabilise the entry.
So that suggestion that he's just been given, brake balance, is usually to do with the split between front and rear axles, how much brake is distributed when for the same force on the pedal, and probably asking him to go forward, so asking the front axle to do more work than the rear. Turn 2 is a place, though, that we've seen a lot of cars struggling with instability. We were talking about the Ferrari earlier on, and Carlos suggesting that it was wind related. It certainly can be quite sensitive, this track, to wind, because you have so many medium speed corners, and it's very easy to upset these cars because they're so reliant on those aerodynamics.
When you say about adjusting the brake balance, saying use more of the front, if Max is losing the rear, how does that actually help them?
So if you imagine a tyre as a human being, and you ask it to make a cup of coffee, could you also put on the kettle for some tea? Could you also turn on the oven? If you keep asking it to do loads and loads of things, it's going to fail and trip and spill your coffee. That was a terrible analogy, but I hope you get my point. You can only ask
Never
it to
work in a restaurant, Jack.
You can only ask it to do so much at any given time. So when you're asking a tyre on the entry of a corner to slow the car down with the brakes and also turn the car and rotate, you have a limit to how much of both it can do. So by transferring more of the braking demand to the front axle, you're giving the rear more breathing space to actually take that load in the corner of the lateral G in the car setting and rotating, and it's less likely to slip, therefore, and basically fail and lose its traction.
It's one job for Jack Aitken only. But if it's explaining F1, then I'm here for it.
Yeah, but definitely not a multitasker. Don't ask me to do any of that.
Oh, don't give me that. The drivers these days having to do so much in that cockpit.
So Ricciardo on the hard tyres just completed his best lap of the session. He's only 18th, but 119.9 compared to the fastest lap of Verstappen on the mediums from earlier, 118.4. So if that's anything to go by, second and a half the difference, but we'll see if that progresses, what sort of length run he's on as well. Lewis Hamilton is 10th at the moment, but he's about to start a lap, so he slows the car down to second gear for turn 1, brakes from 190 miles an hour, and then already they're up to 6th gear by the time they get through the kink, which runs right hand and downhill into the left hand downhill corner at turn 3, 4th gear, 75 miles an hour, and downhill length through the quick right-hander at turn 3 to the bottom of the valley. Then they begin to climb up through a very quick left-hander 6th gear corner at turn 4 and up to the crest into turn 5, which is where Perez lost it yesterday. In this middle sector of the lap, Jack, this is where it really starts to flow.
Yeah, it starts with a little bit of a clumsy chicane, which he goes through now. The little right-left, you have to clatter the curves because it's the shortest line through the corner, but then you tip into turns 8 and 9, a very flowing left-right, which actually goes on for a long time, but you can carry a lot of speed through turn 10, which is easy flat in the dry, and tip it into turn 11, which is the scariest corner on the track, probably. All of the curve on the exit, the car bottoming very heavily, but it's all good. It's a green sector. He's half a second off Verstappen into turn 12 and into now the last 2 corners, both very long hairpins. You have to be very patient on the throttle. He gets a little kick from the rear, but it's not too bad. Enter hard on the brake and asking the car to rotate a lot as you go into the last corner over the curbs on the exit, and it's 4 tenths off for Hamilton at P10.
Yeah, and on the medium tyres, so it's his best lap, but he stays in 10th place overall. Tsunoda also on the hard tyre, the AlphaTauri behind his teammate Ricciardo now. It's still for that 119.9, but he's backed off on the next lap, Ricciardo. Tsunoda, though, has gone quicker slightly, 119.7, and that's a 119.743 to put him up to 17th place and just about a 10th quicker than his teammate.
I've got a question from Chris, not you, Chris, a different Chris.
I can't multitask.
We've been talking about the tyre allocation, the alternative tyre allocation this weekend, with the drivers being told which tyres to run in the different parts of qualifying. Chris wants to know that if we get weather problems today, do the 3 different tyre rules get dropped completely? Obviously, blue skies at the moment over the Hungaroring, but as we know, the weather can change quite quickly here at the Hungaroring. So what happens then?
Yeah, if in qualifying itself, you mean if it's wet or intermediate sessions, yeah, then it would change the whole rule, as it would in a dry race where you wouldn't then have to use 2 compounds of tyres. I suppose the question then comes in, if one session is wet and then it dries out maybe for the 3rd part of qualifying, I think they'll then revert to back what it should be. So if it's wet for the first part, damp for the second, then dry for the 3rd.
I think once it's wet, and then
for the whole
tyre
session.
choice
Do
is
whatever
free.
you want.
Yeah, because it's one. Although it's split into 3 parts, it's one qualifying session technically. So once the tyre choice becomes free because of rain, it's free.
Yeah. If it's dry at the end, then they'll go for the soft anyway, wouldn't they?
Well, at that point, no one's got any softs, so they're probably praying now the rain does stay away in case it all changes.
We're now seeing quite a lot of cars back in pit lane, almost waiting for the last runs. We've got 26 minutes to go in this this practice session, excuse me. And it looks like a few people have settled into more of those long runs that we saw the AlphaTauris doing earlier on. So just doing a bit of data gathering for the race tomorrow afternoon. They have to do it at some point, and using the tyres that they were running on earlier this session, once they've got that quick run out of them, is a good efficient way of doing it. I'm just seeing on our screens the radio text played out for Daniel Ricciardo, his engineer, asking him to do a double cool down. So more cars struggling with the temperature of their tyres, and he's on the hard, so even with the hardest compound that we have available here, they're having to do a double cool down to bring that back to its operating temperature where it has been overheating during a push lap.
Interestingly, track limits doesn't seem to have been much of an issue so far this weekend. Just looking at the stewarding screen, not many messages popping up.
No, it's relatively self-policing here at the Hungarian ring, which is always a pleasure, isn't it? We've talked about curb usage a lot, but it tends to be difficult to go over the white line because of either AstroTurf, which is quite used on the exit of the last corner, first corner, turn 3, and a few other places as well, exit turn 9. And that's less grip, it's slower, it does tend to throw the rear of the car out and unsettle things, especially when you've got 1,000 horsepower under your right foot. And the other corners, like the chicane, tight corners of 6 and 7, that is self-policing because the curves are too big. Once you start to go too far over the white lines, and you'll actually damage the floor, which I think we saw Piastri do yesterday.
Do we need to start worrying about Carlos Sainz? Because he's stone last at the moment. We haven't seen a great deal of the Ferrari driving.
Leclerc isn't that much further ahead of them, both really. On the medium tyre. Leclerc's 1 second off in 16th, and Sainz is stone dead last with 1.8 seconds off the lead. So neither of them looking too impressive. But we will see. This is now on board with Alonso, is what you can hear. He's on a set of the softs.
I think he's on a new set of softs, actually, Jack, according to the data.
The sidewalls do look quite nice and shiny, so we're going to go on board with him into turn 1, braking and going a little bit deep. It's okay, though. He keeps it rolling, doesn't panic, gets a nice, good exit for the mini straight that runs into turn 2. Now asking the car to do a big old turn as your camber is falling away from you, going downhill into turn 3, bottoming as you go through the apex, but no dramas for Alonso. Up to turn 4, another very fast corner, using all the curb on the exit, very important to carry your speed there. Into turn 5, going slightly uphill, the track helping you this time as the grip comes with the uphill pressing into the car. Through the chicane, a little bit of curb, not too aggressive, into turns 8 and 9, nibble of the red and white striped curbs as well. It's looking fairly neat and tidy, but not blisteringly quick so far. We'll see his sector 2 time as he comes across turn 11. And he's actually 300s up. He's gone quite quickly through sector 2. No purples, but it's pretty good, nice and consistent. Dips onto the AstroTurf through turn 12, but no harm done. Nice and tight for 13, getting right to the white line. We've seen a few people going wide, but he doesn't. Into the last corner, waiting for the speed to draw off the car and get back on the throttle. And it looks like a nice clean sector.
Yeah, personal bests in all 3 sectors for Fernando Alonso, and no purple sectors, but overall that was a tidy lap that's put him quickest, top of the times for Fernando with a 1 minute 18.350, looking to get back on the podium. The driver 3rd in the championship, has had 6 podium finishes so far this season, but has had 2 Grand Prix on the trot now without being on the podium, even though he's been in the points in every single race so far this year. And that was a lovely lap. It all looked very smooth, like it was on a pair of rails, really, didn't it? Which is a bit under Fernando-like in some respects.
It is, yeah. I wonder now if we will see, if other people do go for a new set of either the mediums or the softs, which we can see here. Gasly is now shaping up for a lap on the mediums. With the track evolution, I think we'll see some quicker times now. He's only just beaten Verstappen's time. And although the lap time itself was quite good, I did feel like there was a bit of margin for improvement in that lap. So it'll be interesting seeing this next flurry.
Just watching the Alpine of Pierre Gasly out on track. Andrew, they are bringing a circuit-specific wing this weekend, and having a little look at the front wing, you might be able to see it. But how does that work with the cost cap and designing a piece of kit specifically for one circuit? Is that not a little bit sort of interesting in terms of spending?
Well, it might be circuit specific for this one, but it also might be circuit specific for another one later in the season. So you've got Singapore, for example, which is a very high downforce track. So you may well find that this wing reappears there, but it obviously won't be used at Spa and Monza, which are 2 of the next 3 races after this one, split by the summer break and also the Dutch Grand Prix. So it's not like they're just spending on one wing for one race. In the past, when there was no budget cap, teams would do basically an entire aerodynamic package just for the Italian Grand Prix and maybe Spa to a degree, but that can't really happen anymore, and they're all balancing cost versus resource and not wanting to exceed the budget cap. Obviously we're going to still have to wait and see whether anyone did exceed the budget cap last year. A bit of pressure on Alpine actually this year, because obviously they started the year saying, oh, we're going to be finishing 4th again, but we're going to close on the top 3 teams. Obviously, Aston Martin's progress has rather thrown that one out. Also, the fact that they had a pretty terrible start to the season, largely because of their own mistakes to some degree. which led to a sort of public telling off from the chief executive, Lauren Rossi, or I should say the former chief executive, because he was moved into a special projects role earlier this week and replaced by a guy called Bruno Fama, who's the vice president responsible for all Formula One projects, and a new guy called Philippe Krief, who's the CEO, who Alpine tell us won't have anything to do with Formula One, but it seems a bit strange that the CEO of Alpine Cars doesn't have anything to do with Formula One. Anyway, there are those in Formula One who think that Lauren Rossi might have just been sort of spun past to the sidelines, if you like, but we'll have to wait and see whether he reappears. But it does rather look like the person who suffered for being told off by Lauren Rossi was Lauren Rossi himself.
Absolutely. I was quite intrigued that Otmar Zafnar, the team principal of Alpine, didn't really know what those special projects were going to be for Lauren Rossi. That was quite interesting.
I mean, look, let's put Lauren Rossi in perspective. He's done a really impressive job to raise the profile of the Alpine brand as road cars. Their sales around the world are obviously they've gone up in large percentage terms. They didn't have very much to go up from, if we're going to be completely frank about it. But whether he's done a good job with the Formula One team is a different question. He absolutely, completely messed up the driver market last year. Didn't only lose Fernando Alonso by refusing to give him a 2-year contract, but also lost Oscar Piastri. Complete foul up. And then he thought that having Pierre Gasly was a sort of like-for-like or even upgrade improvement on Alonso, which he clearly isn't. Jack Aitken's trying to make a point. Are you going to criticise Lauren Rossi as well?
I suppose I am in an indirect way, because I was going to just point out that the man that is P4 on the timesheets right now, Guan Yu Zhao, of course, was an Alpine junior driver as well. So we've now got, what is it? Is it 3 drivers, ex-Alpine Academy drivers on the grid that are not in Alpine cars? So 2 or 3. But I do think that the management of that whole situation, as you say, was really poor. They were trying to finesse things when it could have been a lot simpler for them. So it's a shame when that happens, because the Enstone team, as we call them colloquially, they do a great job. It's an outfit that has a lot of team members that have been there for decades through all the changes of ownership, and to see them getting so close to the podiums now, it's almost a bit frustrating. Just to see them get over the line would be nice in a way, but not the best management.
I mean, Lauren Rossi's problem started when his first act as CEO of Alpine was to sign Esteban Ocon to a 3-year contract when he really didn't need to do that. And lots of people in Formula 1 were like, what are you doing? Not because they particularly don't rate Esteban Ocon, but just that he's not of the calibre of driver that you need to lock down for that length of time. It's one thing to lock Charles Leclerc down for 5 years, or Max Verstappen, or someone like that, but Ocon's not an A-star level driver. So, and that basically removed his room for manoeuvre when it came to Alonso, because they already had one seat occupied. And then it was like, well, we're messing about with him, we don't know how long we want him. They were talking about wanting to give him a 1+1 year contract, but they were trying to farm Piastri off to Williams for 2 years at the same time. Well, if you're farming Piastri off for 2 years, why are you only offering Alonso a 1+1? Doesn't make any sense. And if he obviously misunderstood Alonso, because Fernando Alonso is not the sort of person who is going to take that as he would have perceived it, lack of respect. He hasn't actually said that there was lack of respect, but he's intimated it. So he dug himself a big hole, and he ended up falling into it, basically. And it looks to me like he's rather paid the price for that, but there you are.
Just looking now at a lap of Norris, who's gone out on a new set of mediums, and he's obliterated the Sector 1 time of Fernando Alonso, which wasn't the best anyway. Alonso sort of crescendoed through the lap and got better and better, and that's come out now because Norris had lost a bit of time relatively to Alonso through Sector 2. It was a bit scruffy at the start of the Sector 2 for Norris, so he might have lost a bit of time to some sideways moments, but could be a new fastest lap on the medium this time.
Yeah, 10.5 down on the overall fastest lap time. He gets very ragged on the way out of the final corner, kicks the back end out, goes over the curbs. It was committed and it was quick in the end. He's gone fastest. That's the absolute best final sector time. And now the overall quickest lap of the session, 1 minute 18.082. That was fully on it. That was a qualifying type run on the mediums from Lando in the McLaren. He's gone quicker than Alonso by almost 0.3 of a second. And then with a 118.350 Alonso second, and with a 118.478 Verstappen from much earlier in the session in third place. And we also saw, he was third, he's now fourth, Valtteri Bottas moving up into, on the medium tyre, on the soft tyre rather, 118.489. He's now got on the hard tyre, and there was a pretty committed lap on the hard tyre from Bottas a couple of minutes ago, which was only just over half a second off his best time on the softer tyre. So that was pretty good from Bottas. And we also had another replay of another moment going off the road for Charles Leclerc, proving the point about that Ferrari being a bit of a wild ride at the moment around the Hungaroring.
Definitely. I think they're going to be deep into the data between now and qualifying to see if they can make any last-minute adjustments to try and calm it down. We got a replay of Norris as well through that last corner, and that was just a case of getting on the power as early as he dared and just hanging on for dear life. Dust was kicking up, marbles flying into the air, and he was all over the exit curve. That was a really brave bit of driving. Insert another word for brave if you like, but I thought it was pretty good. We're now seeing the two Mercedes gearing up for what looks like a quali sim. They've got some very slow outlaps on a new set of softs, both of them. So they're just trying to make sure they don't take any of that goodness out of the new tyre before they actually need it, and Russell shapes up now for his lap.
And that run through the final sector from Lando Norris, and the run through the final turn in particular, that just breathes confidence, doesn't it? Just shows how confident he is at the moment in the car, which is something he's not had in the first part of the season.
He's very comfortable with the McLaren philosophy in general, I think, and the way that they've designed their cars while he's been there. It's something that Daniel really struggled with while he was there, and he sort of cited it publicly, saying, yeah, Lando just knows how to drive this car. It demands a certain style, and he does look confident every time he jumps in. But now that sector one, which was so impressive of Norris, has been eclipsed ever so slightly by Russell, who's gone 100th quicker than him.
Three very different sectors here. The first sector obviously includes the straight, that quick run out downhill through turns 1 and 2. And then the middle sector is all about medium speed corners. It's got the chicane in there, it's flow, it's up and down, mainly downhill. And then that final sector, which is the shorter sector, which has the two final hairpins in it. So in the middle sector was the one where Alonso seemed to have been the most impressive, and that's where Russell's lost out as well. He's 2 tenths down now. But the absolute best first sector of the lap and the best second sector has just gone to Lewis Hamilton, which puts him just about 2.5 tenths of a second up at the moment on Norris's time. Can he be as committed through the final corner as Norris? That'll be hard to achieve, but we'll see what he does when he gets there in about 6 seconds time. Russell's gone third in the meantime. Here's Hamilton out of the final corner, and over the start finish line he goes, and he goes quickest by 0.271 seconds on the soft tyre.
That's a good lap from Hamilton. He's gone nearly 6 tenths of a second quicker than Russell, who didn't look like he was hanging about. There weren't any obvious mistakes, although we're just getting a replay of Russell's lap coming out of turn 4 into turn 5, and there's nothing to see there, so I don't know why we saw that replay. It looked fine to me, or maybe track limits they were pointing out maybe, but I don't think that's a big issue this weekend. So yeah, really good lap from Hamilton, and the Mercedes looking a little bit stronger now.
Now, a bit like he did in almost every session at Silverstone, every time somebody goes quicker than him, Verstappen thinks, well, I'm not having this. He goes out and he goes quicker still. So he's now set the absolute best first sector time, the personal best in sector 2 as well. But overall, he's down by 1.5 tenths. So that middle sector is the one. What can he get back through the third sector then? He's on that run home now in the Red Bull, coming up to the final corner, and a bit of traffic gets out of the way just in time. Through turn 14 he goes. He's 5th at the moment. Verstappen, he goes over the line, and it's going to put him 2nd, but he's still 2.5 tenths down on Hamilton.
So just on track limits, everyone, there will be an issue if you go over the white line. So your lap time will be deleted, basically. So that lap from Russell, if he'd done that at turn 4 in qualifying, he would have lost that time.
You see, so that I don't get then why the stewards just don't do that during the free practice sessions, because this is where we saw a lot of the mess in Austria during the sprint qualifying, where we went through the first practice session, which was their only chance to get their eye in, and there were almost no warnings given during that session, although it was made clear in the driver briefing notes they would police it. But the drivers all went out, got their references, and must have thought to themselves, oh, are they going to be a little bit lax here? Maybe I can get away with just a little bit. And then they all got slapped pretty hard in the sprint qualifying, and it ended up looking a bit silly. So I wish that they would just start policing it straight from the gun.
So everybody knows where they are. Because naturally, as a racing driver, you're going to try and push the envelope. You've got to, because if you don't, everybody else will.
Yeah, and I don't want to hang around too long on this, because we spend so much time talking about it. Here's Verstappen anyway.
It's unbelievable.
Okay, well, he's not happy. This is the sound of Perez's on board. He's on lap 2, but yeah, the thing that drivers struggle with is, although yes, you can see the white line, when you're going at 150 miles an hour on the exit of a corner like turn 4, you don't operate really by visuals as much as by feel. You can feel the curb. That's why they were running up against the edge of the curbs in Austria and using those serrated edges as a feedback, a visceral feedback. And they do the same here in Hungary. So that's a lot easier to judge than a white line, which of course is just paint. So I think a lot of drivers would feel more comfortable if the curbs were deemed as the limit, and we get a lot of arguments about that, but hey ho, it is what it is, and Perez is about to finish his lap.
Here he goes, and over the line, it's tidy. Is it quick coming out of the final turn? It's all right, third place. 0.263 seconds adrift of Hamilton's best time, but interestingly, only 13 thousandths of a second slower than his teammates. So Hamilton quickest, 1 minute 17.811. Max Verstappen, 1:18.061 in second. And then we've got Perez third, 1:18.074, all on the soft tyres, of course. Lando Norris from about 5 or 6 minutes ago, 1:18.082 down to fourth place now. Fernando Alonso from just before that, 1:18.350 in fifth. George Russell recently going sixth quickest, and now with a 1:18.398. Interestingly, we're still 0.2 of a second slower than we were in free practice 2 yesterday, even though the track's been rubbered up a bit more.
Except it hasn't, because it threw it down with rain last night. So all the rubber's been washed away.
Right.
It's warmer as well, a lot warmer, the track temperature, isn't it?
Of course, when it's warmer, cars and tyres generally struggle a little bit more, less power, less grip from the tyre. It tends to overheat that bit quicker. It is interesting watching those teams out there, such as Alfa Romeo, who are still doing qualifying simulations on the hard compound, because they obviously feel the need to brush up on that compound ahead of Q1. You've got a lot of there's a lot on your plate to get through in such a short span of practice, because if you really want to get a handle on how the tyre warms up, like Alfa Romeo, well, you're going to sacrifice a soft tyre run should you get through to Q3. So you really have to juggle those things. And what we're seeing generally between the compounds is quite a clear hierarchy. That's, yes, soft is quickest, medium, middle, and the hard is struggling to match the pace, which isn't always the case, especially when you have tyres overheating, because the harder compounds sometimes can actually start to come into their own towards the end of the lap.
Yeah, I mean, certainly for Alfa, getting out of Q1 is key. Bottas is best qualifying 10th at Miami, and Joe's best qualifying 12th in the second weekend of the season at Saudi Arabia. But that's more often than not. Well, certainly Bottas got into Q2. So impressive that from Lewis Hamilton a few minutes ago. 1 minute 17.811, quarter of a second quicker than Max Verstappen, with just about 7.5 minutes left to go.
Not bad for a guy who said the car was at its worst yesterday. And we were just looking at a track dominance map, and it shows obviously Hamilton's ahead of Verstappen. But with the upgrades that Red Bull are bringing this weekend, as we hear from Carlos Sainz,
I think I have a Tito stuck on my rear wing, but hopefully it clears. Copy it.
Yeah, we can see that from the rear-facing onboard. It's got a tear-off, which is stuck right in the middle part of the rear wing. Is that going to be an issue or not, Jack?
It's going to cost him 0.0002% of his overall downforce. I'm sure he'll live.
as it flaps in the breeze.
How did he know it was on there, though? He can't see that. That's quite impressive.
You'd be surprised. the flickering plastic does pick up quite well on in your mirrors, and the drivers know exactly what they're looking at after so long in the cars. But
you can see a transparent tear off, but you can't see a Formula 1 car in your rear mirrors. I like that.
Or a yellow flag sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Sainz is just certainly a pretty decent first sector time there, the absolute best first sector. So he's stone last at the moment.
Maybe it's acting as a sail.
Yeah, well, I mean, even quicker without that, wouldn't he?
But it's just interesting because obviously the upgrades that Red Bull were bringing, Max Verstappen said, they're going to help us in the twisty bits, the corners around the track. But actually, Hamilton looked more dominant in those twisty parts of the track in the Mercedes than Max did in the Red Bull.
Yeah, what I picked up from that map was Hamilton was generally stronger in the proper low-speed sections of this track, the chicanes, the real hairpins, whereas once they got onto slightly higher speed sections like turn 4, 5, turn 11, the Red Bull did look like it was faster for Verstappen, and it looks like it's working very well.
Yeah, Sainz the personal best sector 2 as well. It's just coming up to the end of the lap. We've had an absolute best from Kevin Magnussen through the first sector as well. Here comes Sainz, then he's gone from stone last up to 7th place, 0.4 of a second away. Personal best for Magnussen in the second sector as well. So K-Mag on a push now through turn 13. Traffic ahead, but he gets out of the way and gets the proper line on the way into turn 14. Slows the car down to about 140k, accelerates out now over the start-finish line. It's going to be a pretty decent lap, puts him 14th, 8/10 down. But that's a few drivers now that have been quicker than Hamilton, who's overall quickest through that first sector. So you're absolutely right, that's where the Mercedes is struggling at the start of the lap.
Hulkenberg's just put in a very good lap. He's gone P4, 2.5 tenths off Hamilton, so that's a very strong effort from him. Magnussen, interestingly, he was also purple in Sector 1 earlier on before this latest flurry of laps, so he's obviously doing something there that is really working for him. But this track, like a lot of others are demanding on the tyres, if you take a lot out of the tyre in the first sector, it can hurt you later on in Sector 3, as we just get a replay of Carlos Sainz going wide, and that would have been a deleted lap according to this latest information from Mr. Benson. So yeah, scratch that one from the timesheets.
So my takeaway from this is that McLaren is looking in really good shape. We're just watching Oscar Piastri actually coming through the second sector, but Lando Norris is okay, he's 5th fastest, but he's only 2.271 off Hamilton's pace, but he's on the medium tyre and Hamilton on the soft. In fact, Hamilton, Verstappen and Perez and Hulkenberg ahead of him, all on the soft tyre. So it does look like that McLaren upgrade has moved them forward on this type of track, as well as the high speed of Silverstone and Austria. So we have to wait and see for sure in qualifying. But Piastri's time didn't go that well. He's down in 14th. He's obviously made a mistake on that lap and added the second or third sector. But I would say, as far as we can tell so far, it is really encouraging for McLaren to have made a sort of holistic step forward, not just on particular types of circuit.
Just going a bit further down the timesheets, as the orders now change fairly significantly, trying to update you as we go, and we're seeing Daniel Ricciardo on our screens now, and that's what I was just going to point out. They are down in 18th and 20th, so not a great result for the AlphaTauris, but Ricciardo is ahead of Tsunoda. He's a few tenths ahead actually, which is quite impressive, and he found most of that gain in Sector 2, which is where the bulk of the work gets done on this lap. So looking quite encouraging for Ricciardo ahead of qualifying.
And they've been concentrating, certainly the second half of the session, on hard tyres and then switching back to the mediums, rather than everybody else has started going onto the softs and go for a qualifying type run. But as you say, that makes perfect sense for them as a team, more worried about Q1 than Q3 to concentrate on that.
They won't make it to Q3, will they? So there's no point in them doing the quali runs on the soft.
No, exactly. 2 minutes and 51 seconds left to go then. We've got Verstappen, Norris and Russell in the pits from the top 10. Carlos Sainz in the pits as well, minus the tear-off strip now. So leaving it late, Ferrari. There was an improvement from Leclerc as well, because they were 16th and last. They're now 7th and 8th. And a replay of Sainz boosting away, coming out of the pit lane. We're getting a replay now on board with Lewis Hamilton, coming up to a Haas and put him off his line or not. In fact, he had a lot of traffic, didn't he? Had a Ferrari, presumably, but Sainz going into the pits. He had another Ferrari through the last corner of Leclerc to get around. So 3 cars to get around in 2 corners at the end of his lap.
I think what we're seeing here is that was pretty lazy from all the cars in front of him, and indeed pretty lazy from Hamilton himself. He didn't seem too concerned in working his way past him with any risk. With 2 minutes to go in the session, the cars that have done their final runs are just circulating now, waiting for the checkered flag so they can do their practice start on the grid, because you get the opportunity here to do that. So they're all just kind of they've made good time on their programs, as it were, got a few minutes in hand, no more work left in the session, but just going around.
It's quite interesting just watching Daniel Ricciardo in the AlphaTauri. Still got a bit of flow-vis on the car, and as you say, not much more work to do, but even with 2 minutes left on the clock, they're still trying to gather some data there.
Yeah, I suppose any opportunity that they can get, trying to understand the airflow and behaviour of that car a little bit, particularly if they've swapped out a part, perhaps a different nose for the second part of this session. You do feel like the more flow-vis used per session is kind of an indicator of how much trouble the team is in with their correlation. And that's not always the case, but it's the running joke. But only a little bit there on the nose for Ricciardo.
He's coming back into the pits now, so hopefully they can work out what, as you say, that new nose, because it is just right at the front of the front wing and up through the middle section of the car, really, isn't it?
Yeah, and he aborted the lap, but he did do his personal best first sector, but we never know what the time would have been. So 1:18.828 for him, a 1:19.156 for Sonoda. So a few tenths in it, but Sonoda, he's out on track. He's done a personal best, and it looks like he's going to complete his lap. He's lost a little bit of time relative to himself through the middle sector. He's now coming out of turn 13. All looks fairly neat and tidy. It's on the medium tyre, and the Japanese driver accelerates, uses plenty of curb on the way out of turn 14, slight uphill climb, and goes over the line and puts in a time of 1:19.239, which is just under a tenth slower than his own personal best. And Perez has gone back out now, and he's off to a quick start, Jack.
Yeah, he's half a tenth up through sector 1 on Hamilton. Not purple, but pretty good sector 1, and he's flying through turn 11 now, pretty neat and tidy. Not using all the curb on the exit, 10th and a half down. And now, at this point, to Hamilton, not a personal best, but yeah, looking pretty tidy. This is with quite a few laps on his soft tyres now, so they will be past their best. But he's doing a good job getting it all the way over to the left-hand side before the final corner. Late apex compared to a lot of the drivers we've seen. DRS open, and it's 2.5 tenths down, so it's an improvement, but he didn't put all of his best sectors together there.
No, he's going to end the session in third place because the checkered flag has now fallen. Sainz has taken the flag as well, but doesn't improve overall. There's a 1:18.4 on that lap, a couple of tenths down on his previous best. So Hamilton, the start of third practice session, which has given them a lot of running. We thought it would be busy, really, with all the time they lost yesterday, particularly in free practice 1, and so it proved to be. Getting a replay now of Ricciardo launching off out of the pits, and whoops, team radio.
Ricciardo just nearly went into the back of me.
Ricciardo nearly went into the back of me because the Alpha that he came upon was Zhou Guanyu, and yeah, that was a bit close.
Yeah, well, Ricciardo was doing a practice start, and of course you do want to get a good amount of distance in at full throttle to really let the engineers have some good data, and he was cutting it pretty fine to get on the brakes before Zhou there, who was waiting to let faster the car through in turn 1.
Yeah, the brakes worked, that's for sure. He tested them out as well. So not giving too much away facially, but Toto Wolff there, the team principal at Mercedes, will be very happy with that, because Lewis Hamilton has ended free practice 3 with the quickest time of the day so far. 1:17.811 with that late effort. Second place, Max Verstappen, 1:18.061. Quarter of a second between them. And then Sergio Perez, third, 1:18.067, having a much better Saturday than Friday so far. Nico Hülkenberg late on, good effort for him in the Haas, 1:18.077, only a hundredth away from Perez, fourth place for him. And then we had Lando Norris, 1:18.082 in fifth, George Russell, 1:18.119 seconds in sixth place, and then seventh was Leclerc, eighth Sainz, both late efforts from the Ferraris, ninth Alonso and 10th Bottas. 11th place we had Stroll, 12th Zhou Guanyu, 13th Alex Albon, 14th Oscar Piastri, 15th was Kevin Magnussen. Pierre Gasly, who was in the top 3 yesterday in free practice 2, only 16th this time, ahead of Logan Sargent 17th, Daniel Ricciardo in 18th place, Esteban Ocon 19th, and Yuki Tsunoda in 20th position at the end of that 1 hour of the final practice session.
Thank you very much, Chris. So who are we looking out for then in qualifying? Anybody already at risk, do you think, Jack?
It's really hard to say, more so than usual, because of the different compounds at play. So not all teams there got a taste of all compounds in Quali Sim. For sure the AlphaTauris look like they're the weakest here this weekend, so they'll be fighting to get out of Q1 if they can at all. The Alpines don't look that strong. Gasly and Ocon both at risk in this session. So those two teams, that aside, I'd have to say the final places is going to be a bit of a you just have to wait and see, really.
Which we quite like. We quite like not knowing as we head into qualifying, with a little bit of jeopardy thrown in with this alternative tyre allocation. Interestingly, Aston Martin split the strategy a little bit. Lance Stroll on the hard tyre and then Fernando Alonso on that soft. So they've got a little bit of knowledge. So many teams opting not to use that hard tyre. And I guess it'll all become clear on how that will operate in Q1, Chris.
Yeah, only 5 or 6 went and used the hard, didn't they? And as Jack said, those more likely to need that good first part of qualifying, which is going to be on the hard tyre for everybody. As we see Lewis Hamilton practice start off the line. He's sort of come from nowhere after a bit of a downbeat day yesterday, but that's what he does. That's why he's 7-time world champion. And the other takeaway, I think, from that session was that the Alphas are looking pretty strong, aren't they? They've got a good chance of making it through to Q2 this afternoon.
Well, there you go. Lewis Hamilton topping the third and final practice session ahead of qualifying later on today, all getting ready for the Hungarian Grand Prix tomorrow afternoon. My thanks to Chris Hartley, to Jack Aitken and the BBC's chief F1 writer, Andrew Benson. We'll be back at 5 to 3 to talk you through qualifying to find out who will be on pole position for tomorrow's Hungarian Grand Prix. Hopefully you can join us on the BBC website. Then we will talk to you a little later on. This has been an IMG production for BBC Radio 5 Live.